I parked my car in the driveway, exhausted from a brutal 16-hour flight, ready to collapse into the comfort of my bed. But something felt off. The air was too still, too quiet. Then I saw it. A bright red "Sold" sign stood proudly on my front lawn, mocking me. My stomach dropped. What the hell? My heart pounded as I stared at my own house, now marked as someone else's property. I scrambled out of the car, fumbling for my keys, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Maybe it was a mistake, a prank. I jammed the key into the lock. Nothing. It wouldn't turn. I tried again, twisting, rattling the handle. The door wouldn't budge. My confusion turned into cold dread. Someone had changed the locks. That's when I heard the voice. Well, look who decided to finally show up. I turned to see Karen, my ever-nosy neighbor, standing on her perfectly trimmed lawn, arms crossed, lips curled in a smug little smile. She was the type of woman who policed garbage bins and counted how many times people mowed their lawns, but even for her, this was a new level of insanity. What the hell is going on? I demanded, gesturing wildly at the sign. She let out an exaggerated sigh, as if she were exhausted by my mere existence. The HOA repossessed your house, obviously. It was abandoned. I blinked at her, words failing me. Abandoned? What are you talking about? I was gone for work. This is my house. Karen shrugged. You should have checked your mail. My fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. I don't even belong to the HOA. She smirked. You do now. My brain short-circuited. None of this made sense. I'd never signed any HOA agreement. I'd specifically bought my house in this neighborhood because it wasn't under an HOA. And yet here I was, standing in front of a house I legally owned but could no longer access. I'm calling the police, I said, reaching for my phone, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. Karen's smug expression didn't falter. Go ahead, she said, inspecting her nails like this was all beneath her. They'll tell you the same thing. The sale is legal. You've already been evicted. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Evicted. From my own damn house. My breaths came faster. I tried to keep my voice level, but panic clawed at my throat. Who the hell bought it? Karen's smirk grew. Oh, my cousin. She got a great deal on it too. Of course she did. I barely heard the sound of sirens in the distance as I dialed 911 myself, my fingers shaking. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of joke. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The cop who showed up was young, barely out of training, and had the kind of blank, rehearsed expression that told me he already knew how this was going to go. Sir, according to the records, this property was transferred to the HOA last month, he said, glancing at his notepad like this was just another Tuesday for him. It was deemed abandoned after multiple warnings were ignored. I didn't get any warnings. I snapped. He didn't even blink. The notices were sent to the listed address. This address. I live here. I gestured wildly to the house that was somehow no longer mine. The officer sighed, clearly not in the mood for my breakdown. Sir, if you have an issue, you'll need to take it up in court. Right now you're trespassing. If the new owner wants to press charges, that's their right. Karen beamed. Oh, don't worry, officer. I won't have him arrested. This time. I had never wanted to strangle another human being more in my life. I stormed back to my car, slamming the door so hard I was sure the neighbors felt it. My vision blurred as I stared at my steering wheel, my entire world collapsing around me. They stole my house. They stole my house and I had no idea how to get it back. I took a deep, shuddering breath and did the only thing I could think of. I called Jacob. Jacob was the kind of lawyer who made other lawyers nervous. He was sharp, ruthless, and best of all, he loved tearing apart H's. I didn't even bother explaining everything over the phone. I need you, I said, voice raw. His response was instant. Whose ass are we suing? An hour later we sat in a dingy diner, my hands still shaking around a cup of coffee that I hadn't even touched. Jacob, on the other hand, looked completely unfazed as he flipped through the stack of documents I'd managed to pull up online about the sale. This is the dumbest case I've ever seen, he muttered, shaking his head. That's not very reassuring. He smirked. Oh, it is. Because it means they screwed up. Badly. He tapped the paper. These documents. Forged as hell. Your signature? Laughable. And this sale? Illegal in about 12 different ways. I exhaled, the first glimmer of hope trickling through my panic. So we can fight this? Oh, we're not just fighting, Jacob said, his grin turning razor sharp. We're going to burn them to the ground. For the first time since I'd arrived home, I smiled. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jacob wasted no time. The moment we left the diner, he was already making calls, his voice sharp and authoritative. I barely kept up as we drove to his office, my mind still reeling from the fact that my house, my home, had been sold out from under me by an HOA I never even agreed to join. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now. By the time we reached his office, Jacob had already arranged for a paralegal to pull every single document related to my property. The moment we stepped inside, he tossed his jacket onto a chair, rolled up his sleeves, and cracked his knuckles like a boxer stepping into a ring. All right, he said, pulling up files on his computer. First things first. How in the hell did an HOA you never joined get the right to sell your house? I ran a hand through my hair, still trying to wrap my head around it. I have no idea. I bought my house specifically because it wasn't in an HOA. No fees, no rules, none of that nonsense. Then I leave for 6 weeks and suddenly I don't own my own home. Jacob clicked his tongue, scrolling through legal records. It's fraud. I can already tell you that much. But we need to figure out exactly how they pulled this off. Because this doesn't just happen. Someone made it happen. He narrowed his eyes at the screen, then let out a low whistle. Well, would you look at that? They filed a covenant addendum. I frowned. A what? A document stating that your property was added to the HOA's jurisdiction. Problem is, it's supposed to require your consent. And according to this, you signed it. My stomach twisted. That's impossible. Jacob spun his monitor around. There, plain as day, was my signature. Or at least a pathetic attempt at it. It wasn't even close to my real handwriting. Whoever did this didn't even try to make it convincing, Jacob said, shaking his head. This is amateur hour forgery. Rage boiled up inside me. Karen, I spat. Jacob smirked. You think she's behind this? I know she is. She was way too smug about the whole thing. And the house just so happened to be bought by her cousin? No way that's a coincidence. Jacob leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk. All right. If Karen's behind it, she didn't do it alone. She's just a busybody. Someone with real authority in the HOA had to sign off on this. I clenched my fists. Then we find out who. Jacob grinned. That's exactly what we're gonna do. We spent the next 2 hours combing through paperwork. I didn't know legal jargon, but Jacob did, and every so often he'd mutter under his breath about violations, fraud, and how stupid these people were for thinking they'd get away with it. Then he found something. Gotcha, he said, eyes glinting with something dangerous. Chad Henderson. HOA president. Looks like he signed off on everything. Who the hell is Chad Henderson? I asked. Jacob pulled up a photo from a news article. This guy. I stared at the picture of a man in his late 50s with the kind of face that screamed country club villain. He wore an expensive suit, had slicked back hair, and the kind of smirk that made me want to punch through the screen. He's been involved in a bunch of shady real estate deals before, Jacob explained. Oversees the HOA like a dictator. And guess what? This isn't the first time they've pulled something like this. My jaw tightened. You're saying they've done this to other homeowners? Jacob nodded. Oh yeah. I'm looking at least 3 other cases where houses were abandoned and conveniently sold to someone connected to HOA board members. And you know what else? He smirked. They're running out of money. I frowned. What do you mean? Jacob leaned forward. HOAs make money through fees. They also have reserve funds. But this one? They're in financial trouble. Their reserves are almost empty and their spending is out of control. They've been hemorrhaging money on projects that don't exist. You know what that means? I felt my pulse quicken. They're scamming homeowners to keep themselves afloat. Bingo, Jacob said, snapping his fingers. They needed a big cash injection. What better way than to steal a house, sell it to a relative for dirt cheap, and pretend everything's legal? I gritted my teeth. Then we exposed them. Jacob smirked. Already ahead of you. The next morning we paid a visit to the county clerk's office. I'd never been in one before, but it smelled like old paper and desperation. We requested copies of every document related to my house, and sure enough, there were even more forged signatures. It wasn't just the HOA agreement. There were fake notices of violations, fabricated warnings, and even a bogus city inspection claiming my property was dangerous and abandoned. I stared at the papers in disbelief. They really went all out, huh? Jacob chuckled. Yeah, but that's their mistake. The more fake paperwork they create, the easier it is to prove fraud. Then came the real kicker. The signature on the city inspection report? Chad Henderson's. Jacob let out a low whistle. Well. Looks like Chad went and impersonated a city official. That's not just fraud. That's a crime. My heart pounded. We finally had something solid. It wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was illegal. Criminal. Jacob grinned like a wolf spotting its prey. This is where we start playing hardball. We're taking this straight to the city, and once they get wind of this, Chad and Karen are gonna be in for a very bad time. I felt something I hadn't in days. Hope. But as we left the clerk's office, I spotted someone watching us from across the street. Karen. She was standing by her car, arms crossed, sunglasses on, but I knew she'd seen us. And from the way her mouth was set in a thin, angry line, she knew we were onto her. I smirked and waved. She stormed off. She knows, I said, glancing at Jacob. Good, he replied, smiling. Let them sweat. I had no idea what Karen and Chad would try next. But one thing was for sure. We were just getting started. The moment Karen spotted us at the clerk's office, I knew things were going to escalate. I could feel it in my gut. She didn't just walk away. She practically stomped off, her entire body radiating frustration. She knew we were digging, and she knew that we weren't going to stop until we uncovered every last shady deal she and Chad had been a part of. Jacob, on the other hand, was absolutely thriving. He loved the chase. The more dirt we found, the more fired up he got. On the ride back to his office, he was already rattling off the next steps. We had city-level fraud, forged documents, and enough inconsistencies in the HOA's financials to suggest embezzlement. But there was one problem. We needed proof that the money had actually been mishandled. Without it, we'd just be throwing around accusations. That's when Jacob had an idea. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, looking far too pleased with himself. We need a mole, he said. I raised an eyebrow. A mole. Someone who's been in the HOA but got screwed over, he explained. Karen and Chad aren't running this alone. There's always someone who gets fed up. We just have to find them. It wasn't a bad idea, but it wasn't like HOA members were walking around with signs that said, willing to betray HOA. I sighed, rubbing my temples. And how do we do that? Jacob smirked. We knock on some doors. That's exactly what we did. We started with my old neighbors, people I hadn't spoken to much before all of this. Most of them were hesitant to say anything. Some were even afraid. Apparently, Chad had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who challenged him. He'd fine people for things that weren't even in the bylaws, sent notices for invisible infractions, and even tried to foreclose on a house just because the owner refused to trim a tree he liked. Then we found her. Margaret was a sweet-looking older woman, probably in her 70s, with silver hair and a quiet voice. She invited us in, offering cookies like we were just visiting for afternoon tea. But the moment Jacob explained why we were there, her entire demeanor changed. She laughed. Not a light chuckle. A full, bitter laugh. Oh, honey, you have no idea what you've stepped into. I leaned forward. Try me. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a folder from the side table. She handed it to Jacob, who flipped it open. His eyebrows shot up. What is this? I asked. Margaret sighed. That, dear, is every financial report the HOA tried to keep hidden. I used to be on the board. I was the treasurer until I started asking too many questions. I felt my heart speed up. And they forced you out? She nodded. More like bullied me out. But I kept copies. I knew something was wrong, but no one would listen to me. And then when I wouldn't stop pushing, they slapped me with fines. Hundreds of dollars for nonsense violations. I had no choice but to sell my house and move into an apartment. Anger surged through me. They forced you out? Not just me, she said, shaking her head. At least 5 other people I know. They pull this scam over and over again. Jacob was already flipping through the papers, eyes scanning them like a predator about to pounce. Oh, these idiots, he muttered under his breath. They didn't even try to cover their tracks. Margaret leaned in, her voice lower now. I hope you take them down. I really do. I looked at her, seeing the years of frustration and helplessness in her eyes. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. This was bigger. Chad and Karen had hurt people. A lot of people. As we left her apartment, Jacob was practically vibrating with energy. "We've got them," he said, grinning like a kid on Christmas. "This proves that they've been misusing HOA funds. We can take this straight to the city." But before we could do that, I wanted to confront Karen. I wanted her to know she had lost. Jacob, to his credit, didn't stop me. In fact, he encouraged it. "Let's rattle her cage a little," he said. "See what she does when she realizes the jig is up." We found her exactly where I expected, on her front porch, sipping tea like she hadn't ruined multiple lives. The moment she saw us, her face twisted into a scowl. "What do you want?" she snapped. I smiled all teeth. "Just thought you'd like to know we paid a visit to Margaret." Karen's expression didn't change, but I saw her grip tighten on her cup. So we have all the financial records now," I said. "Every illegal transaction. Every dime you and Chad stole. We know everything." For a split second I saw real fear in her eyes. But then she schooled her expression back into something cold and dismissive. "You think you can prove anything?" she scoffed. "Please. You don't have a case." Jacob stepped forward, his smile even sharper than mine. "Oh, but we do. And guess what? City officials love cases like this. Fraud, embezzlement, forgery." He let the last word hang in the air, watching as Karen's face paled slightly. "Chad's about to have a very, very bad day." Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden porch. "This is harassment." Jacob chuckled. "No, this is karma." As we walked away, I heard her mutter something under her breath. I couldn't make it out, but I knew it wasn't good. Later that night my phone rang. It was Jacob. "We've got movement," he said. "What do you mean?" "Karen and Chad just withdrew 10 grand from the HOA account." My stomach dropped. "They're trying to run." "Looks like it," Jacob said. "But they won't get far." I made a few calls. "The city's already interested in our little case. Tomorrow morning we're filing the lawsuit. And after that..." I took a deep breath. "After that we end this." This was no longer just about getting my house back. This was about making sure Karen, Chad, and the entire corrupt system they built came crashing down around them. They had stolen from good people. They had destroyed lives. But now they were the ones about to lose everything. The next morning I woke up to a text from Jacob that made my heart race. "They're panicking. Chad just called a meeting. Get ready." I didn't know what to expect, but I knew one thing for certain. Karen and Chad weren't the type to go down quietly. They were going to fight, and they were going to fight dirty. I met Jacob at his office and he already had a plan. "We're filing today," he said, sipping his coffee like it was just another casual Wednesday. "Fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. And we're making it public." My eyebrows shot up. "Public?" He grinned. "Oh yeah. City officials, local news, maybe even a few homeowner advocacy groups. The more eyes on this, the harder it is for them to weasel out of it." I liked the way he thought. We arrived at the courthouse, filed the lawsuit, and just as Jacob had promised, it didn't stay quiet for long. Within hours, word had spread. Calls started rolling in. Apparently, Chad had ticked off a lot of people over the years, and now they finally had a reason to speak up. Homeowners who had been strong-armed into selling. People who had been fined into oblivion over non-existent violations. Even former board members who had been forced out when they asked too many questions. The floodgates had opened and the HOA was drowning. Karen, however, wasn't going to let herself sink without a fight. That afternoon I was sitting in my car going through emails when a police cruiser pulled up behind me. My stomach twisted as an officer stepped out and walked straight toward me. "Sir, I need to ask you to step out of the vehicle." My pulse spiked. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. He just gestured again. "Step out of the vehicle." I did as I was told, my mind racing. Then I saw her. Karen stood across the street, arms crossed, smirking like she had already won. I should have known she'd pull something like this. The officer glanced at his notepad. "We received a report that you vandalized the HOA office last night." I blinked. "I what?" He kept his face neutral. "There's a broken window, spray paint on the walls, and the security footage shows someone matching your description near the property." I could have laughed at the absurdity of it if I wasn't so furious. That's ridiculous, I said. I was home last night. The officer raised an eyebrow. Do you have proof of that? I clenched my jaw. My lawyer does. Jacob arrived within the hour and he was not in the mood. He immediately pulled out my alibi, credit card records, emails, and most importantly, security footage from my property showing I was home at the time of the so-called incident. The officer looked it over, then sighed. Looks like we've got conflicting evidence, he said. We'll investigate further. Karen's smirk faded just a little. As soon as the officer left, Jacob turned to her. That was cute, he said. A false police report? That's a crime, you know. Karen's face twisted. I don't know what you're talking about. Jacob chuckled. Sure you don't. Just like you don't know how you forged HOA agreements or how you and Chad have been siphoning money for years. Her eyes darted around as if looking for an escape. You don't have any proof. Jacob's smirk was razor sharp. Oh, but we do. Karen didn't reply. She just turned on her heel and stormed off. I had a feeling that wouldn't be the last trick she'd try. Later that night I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment I answered. You think you're so smart, don't you? Chad's voice was thick with arrogance. Filing a lawsuit, getting the city involved? Big mistake. I rolled my eyes. Oh no, what are you going to do? Fine me for not cutting my grass. His voice turned sharp. You're messing with something bigger than you understand. Back off or you'll regret it. I almost laughed. Is that a threat? It's a warning, he snapped. Good, I said. Then here's my warning. You and Karen are done. Your little scam is falling apart, and once the city is through with you, you won't just be out of the HOA. You'll be out of options. There was a long silence. Then he hung up. The next morning the Real bomb dropped. Jacob called me at dawn, his voice crackling with energy. Check your email. Now. I sat up, grabbed my phone and opened the link he sent me. It was an article. Local HOA under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. I skimmed through it, my heart racing. Everything was there. The fake home seizures, the fraudulent signatures, even the missing money from the HOA's reserve fund. And best of all, there was a picture of Chad looking pale and furious, caught outside his house as a reporter shoved a microphone in his face. I grinned. You did this. Jacob chuckled. Nope. One of the homeowners we talked to took the story to the press. The city's already launching an investigation. Then, as if on cue, another message popped up. A new email. From Margaret. I opened it and my breath caught. She had attached a bank statement. One that showed a very large, very illegal transfer from the HOA account to an offshore bank. And the name on the account. Chad Henderson. I showed Jacob and his grin widened. Well. Looks like Chad just gave us the final nail for his coffin. It didn't take long after that. By the end of the day, city officials had already issued a freeze on the HOA's accounts. Karen had gone silent. Chad, on the other hand, had lawyered up and was scrambling to defend himself. But the evidence was overwhelming. Jacob and I stood outside the courthouse watching as news cameras swarmed the place. I felt a sense of satisfaction unlike anything I had ever felt before. This is just the beginning, Jacob said. Once the lawsuit goes through, you'll get your house back. And Chad and Karen? I asked. Jacob smirked. Let's just say they'll be busy dealing with their own legal problems for a long, long time. I took a deep breath. The nightmare wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks I felt like I was finally winning. And I had a feeling Chad and Karen were about to lose everything. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back rows, murmuring among themselves as cameras clicked and pens scratched against notepads. Homeowners who had been wronged by the HOA filled every available seat, their faces a mix of anger and anticipation. I sat beside Jacob, my pulse steady but my fingers twitching against the table. This was it. The moment we had been waiting for. Chad sat across the room, his usual arrogance drained from his face. He looked haggard, his suit slightly wrinkled, his forehead glistening under the fluorescent lights. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Word on the street was that she had jumped ship, trying to distance herself from the mess she helped create. But it was too late for both of them. The evidence was undeniable. The judge entered and the courtroom fell silent. What followed was a legal takedown so methodical, so ruthless, that even I was in awe. Jacob went in for the kill immediately, laying out every forged document, every fraudulent transaction, every illegal move the HOA had made. He painted a picture so damning that even Chad's high-priced attorney struggled to come up with a defense. The city investigator took the stand, confirming that Chad had indeed funneled HOA funds into his own personal accounts. The forged HOA agreement that added my house to their jurisdiction was analyzed, and a handwriting expert confirmed what we already knew: my signature had been faked. One after another, homeowners testified about the harassment they endured, the threats, the fines, the forced sales. Then the final blow came. Karen had folded under pressure. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she had agreed to testify against Chad. When she walked into the courtroom, Chad's face twisted in pure hatred. She wouldn't look at him. Instead, she sat down, adjusted her microphone, and in a voice that was surprisingly steady, began detailing every shady deal she had been a part of. She admitted to pressuring homeowners into selling. She admitted to fabricating violations to justify foreclosures. And most damning of all, she admitted that the HOA had specifically targeted me because they knew I was out of town and wouldn't be able to fight back immediately. It was a strategy they had used before. I had just been the latest victim. Chad's attorney tried to discredit her, but the damage was done. The judge listened, nodding occasionally, but his expression never wavered. When closing arguments were given, Jacob left no room for doubt. "This is not a case of simple mismanagement," he said, voice steady. "This is organized fraud. A scheme to strip people of their homes under the guise of authority. And now those responsible must answer for it." The jury didn't take long to deliberate. When they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty on multiple counts. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, the whole 9 yards. Chad was sentenced to prison, his empire crumbling around him. The HOA, already bankrupt, was officially dissolved. Karen, though spared a lengthy sentence, was ordered to pay damages to the homeowners she had wronged. But the best part? My house was officially mine again. The fraudulent sale was voided. The forged documents were erased. Legally, it was as if none of it had ever happened. Walking back onto my property, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The sold sign was gone. The locks had been changed back. My home, after everything, was still standing. That night I threw a party. Every homeowner who had suffered under the HOA showed up. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a victory lap. We laughed, drank, and swapped horror stories about Chad and Karen. The mood was electric, a collective release of years of frustration. At some point, Jacob raised a glass and tapped it with a spoon. The crowd quieted, all eyes on him. "To justice," he said, lifting his drink. "And to never dealing with another HOA scam again." The cheers were deafening. As the night wound down, I stood on my porch, watching as people slowly drifted away, their laughter lingering in the cool night air. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace. Real, honest peace. The nightmare was over. But I wasn't done. In the days that followed, I turned my experience into something bigger. With Jacob's help, I launched a website dedicated to exposing corrupt HOAs. I shared my story, provided resources for homeowners facing similar battles, and connected with people across the country who had been victims of the same kind of fraud. The response was overwhelming. Emails poured in. People who thought they had no way out suddenly realized they could fight back. Lawyers reached out, offering pro bono work. Journalists started digging deeper into other shady HOAs. It became something bigger than me, bigger than my one case. Karen and Chad had tried to take everything from me. Instead, they had created their own worst nightmare. Months later, I got an email from an old neighbor. It was a screenshot of Karen's new job listing. She was working at a call center, far removed from her days of playing queen of the neighborhood. He was still behind bars, facing even more lawsuits as former HOA members turned on him, eager to save themselves. I smiled. Poetic justice. My house was mine. My life was back. And best of all, I had made sure they would never do this to anyone else again.